Picture the scene: a luxurious first-class cabin, the gentle hum of the jet engines, and a woman who has paid top dollar for her well-deserved seat. Then comes the heavy tap on the shoulder. An arrogant corporate executive decides a black woman simply doesn't belong in the premium cabin next to him, demanding she be sent to the back of the plane. He thinks his wealth and status make him untouchable. He thinks he can bully her and the flight crew into submission. But he has absolutely no idea who she really is or the devastating reality of who is listening from the cockpit. What follows is a brutal, masterclass dose of instant karma that left the entire flight speechless. Buckle up, because you won't believe the stunning twist in this real-life nightmare. Dr. Celeste Bennett let out a long, quiet sigh as she sank into the plush leather of seat 2A. At 38, she was one of the leading pediatric neurosurgeons at Johns Hopkins Hospital, and the past 48 hours had been an unrelenting marathon of high-stakes operations and minimal sleep. The soft, ambient lighting of Atlantic Airways Flight 72 to London Heathrow felt like a sanctuary. She had paid cash for this first-class ticket, nearly $9,000, because she needed every second of the transatlantic flight to rest. Tomorrow morning, the moment she landed, she was scheduled to consult on a highly sensitive emergency surgery at Great Ormond Street Hospital. Celeste slipped off her loafers, adjusted her noise-canceling headphones around her neck, and accepted a warm towel and a glass of sparkling water from a smiling flight attendant named Sarah. For the first time in days, Celeste felt her shoulders drop. The cabin was only half full so far, exuding the quiet, hushed privilege of international premium travel. 10 minutes before the cabin doors were scheduled to close, Roman Standish boarded the aircraft. Roman was a man who moved through the world as if he owned the floor beneath his feet. A senior vice president at a prestigious Manhattan wealth management firm, he was dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit that looked slightly rumpled from his rush through the terminal. He was 52, red-faced from a mix of high blood pressure and pre-flight scotch, and visibly irritated by the sheer inconvenience of having to walk through an airport like a commoner after his private car service had arrived late. He stomped down the aisle of the first-class cabin, tossing his leather briefcase into the overhead bin with a reckless thud that made a few passengers flinch. He looked down at his boarding pass. Seat 2B. Roman looked at the empty aisle seat. Then, his eyes slid over to the window seat. Seat 2A, and locked onto Celeste. Celeste had her eyes closed, quietly enjoying the classical music faintly playing over the cabin speakers. She didn't notice him at first. It was the sharp, aggressive clearing of a throat that pulled her from her near slumber. She opened her eyes to find Roman standing over her, one hand resting on the back of her seat, leaning in with an air of absolute authority. "Excuse me," Roman said, his tone lacking any actual polite intent. It was the voice of a man used to giving orders to subordinates. "I think you're in the wrong cabin." Celeste blinked, slightly disoriented, before sitting up straighter. She looked around, then back up at him. "I'm sorry?" "I said, you're in the wrong section," Roman repeated, his voice carrying a deliberate, slow cadence, as if speaking to a child who didn't understand English. He gestured vaguely toward the rear of the aircraft. "Premium economy and main cabin are that way. This is first class." Celeste felt a familiar, exhausting heat prickle at the back of her neck. It wasn't the first time in her life someone had looked at her, a younger black woman in a casual cashmere sweater and leggings, and assumed she didn't belong in a space of privilege. But she was too tired to engage in a battle of egos. "I'm in the right seat, thank you," Celeste said calmly, giving him a tight, dismissive smile before reaching for her headphones. Before she could put them on, Roman reached down and tapped the top of her headrest sharply. "Look, I've had a remarkably long day. I don't want to have to call a flight attendant to have you escorted back to your actual seat. You're in 2A. My seat is 2B. I paid for this row to have peace and quiet, not to deal with someone who thinks they can just sneak up here for an unearned upgrade before takeoff." Celeste slowly lowered her headphones. The quiet sanctuary of the cabin was instantly shattered. A few rows back, an older gentleman peered over the top of his newspaper, his brow furrowed in concern. "Sir," Celeste said, her voice dropping an octave, steady and cold as ice. "I am in seat 2A. I paid for seat 2A. Now, please, take your seat in 2B and leave me alone." Roman's face flushed a deeper shade of crimson. The utter refusal of this woman to bow to his authority seemed to short-circuit his brain. We'll see about that, he sneered. He whipped his head around and snapped his fingers loudly down the aisle. Miss? Excuse me, flight attendant, we have a situation here. Sarah Jenkins, a junior flight attendant, barely 24 years old, hurried up the aisle, her face a mask of customer service panic. Yes, sir? Is everything all right? No, everything is not all right, Roman barked, pointing a rigid finger at Celeste. This woman is sitting in 2A. I am in 2B. I need you to check her boarding pass and escort her back to her assigned seat so I can sit down. Sarah looked nervously between the tall, imposing businessman and the calm, seated woman. Oh, ma'am, I'm so sorry to bother you. Could I just see your boarding pass really quickly to clear this up? Celeste didn't break eye contact with Roman. She reached into her carry-on tote, pulled out her phone, and tapped the screen, bringing up the digital boarding pass. She held it up so both Sarah and Roman could clearly see it. Celeste Bennett, first class. Seat 2A. Thank you, Miss Bennett, Sarah said, visibly relieved. She turned to Roman with a bright, apologetic smile. Sir, she is in the correct seat, seat 2A. You are in 2B, right here on the aisle. If you'll just step in. That's impossible, Roman interrupted, his voice rising, effectively killing the quiet ambiance of the cabin. There is an obvious mistake. The system must have glitched. Or she's an off-duty employee flying non-rev who got bumped up. I specifically requested an empty seat next to me. I paid full fare. I am a Platinum Medallion member with this airline. Sir, the flight is nearly full. We don't guarantee empty adjacent seats even for our Medallion members, Sarah tried to explain gently. And Miss Bennett is a ticketed passenger for this seat. I don't care what your little tablet says, Roman snapped, leaning closer to Sarah, trying to physically intimidate the young woman. I fly this route twice a month. I bring hundreds of thousands of dollars of business to Atlantic Airways. I am not sitting next to her. The implication hung in the air, heavy and toxic. Celeste's jaw tightened. She had dealt with arrogant hospital administrators and entitled parents of patients, but the raw, unfiltered prejudice rolling off this man was staggering. If you have a problem sitting next to me, Celeste said, her voice piercing through his rant with surgical precision, then I suggest you take it up with the airline and find a seat in coach. Or better yet, get off the plane. Because I am not moving. Roman spun on her, his eyes wide with fury. Who the hell do you think you are talking to? You think because you manipulated the system to get a free seat up here, you can speak to me like that? I bought this ticket, Celeste replied firmly. Oh, please, Roman scoffed, a cruel, mocking laugh escaping his lips. People like you don't buy $9,000 tickets. You either used a buddy pass or you're completely bankrupting yourself for an Instagram photo. Now, I want you out of my row. Sarah, the flight attendant, was now trembling slightly. Sir, please lower your voice. You cannot speak to another passenger that way. Please take your seat. I am not sitting down until she is moved, Roman yelled, officially crossing the line from an annoyance to a cabin disturbance. Passengers in the front rows of the premium economy section were craning their necks to see what was happening. Get me the purser, Roman demanded, staring down at Sarah. Get me the purser, get me the captain, get whoever is in charge of this metal tube, because you are clearly too incompetent to do your job. I want her moved, and I want it done now. Within seconds, the lead purser, a formidable woman in her 50s named Brenda, marched down the aisle. Brenda had been flying for 25 years. She had seen every iteration of bad behavior known to aviation, and she tolerated exactly none of it. What seems to be the problem here? Brenda asked, her voice calm but layered with unmistakable authority. The problem, Brenda, Roman said, reading her name tag and speaking with dripping condescension, is that your gate agents have screwed up the manifest. I am Roman Standish, Senior Executive Vice President at Vanguard Holdings. I fly with you constantly. I expect a certain level of service and a certain environment in this cabin. This woman, he gestured dismissively toward Celeste, is hostile, belligerent, and refuses to admit she doesn't belong here. I want her removed from the flight for my safety and peace of mind. The sheer audacity of the lie caused a ripple of murmurs throughout the first-class cabin. Arthur Pendleton, the older gentleman sitting across the aisle in 2D, finally had enough. That is a load of absolute garbage, Arthur called out, his British accent cutting through the tension. This young lady has been sitting quietly. You are the one shouting and making a bloody fool of yourself. Leave her alone." "Mind your own business, old man," Roman shot back, his face now a dangerous, mottled purple. He turned back to Brenda. "I want her out. If she stays in this seat, I will personally see to it that you, this little girl here," he pointed at Sarah, "and the gate staff are all standing in the unemployment line by Monday morning. Do you understand who I am?" Brenda didn't flinch. "Mr. Standish, I do not care who you are. I care about the safety and security of my cabin. Miss Bennett has a valid ticket for 2A. You have a valid ticket for 2B. You have two choices. Sit in 2B, or I can have the gate agent come back down the jet bridge and escort you off the aircraft." Roman laughed a dry, humorless sound. He genuinely could not fathom that his threats weren't working. His wealth and title had always been his get-out-of-jail-free card. In his boardroom, when he yelled, people cowered. "You're making a massive mistake," Roman hissed, pulling out his phone. "I have the personal cell phone number of your VP of Customer Relations. But before I call him, I want to speak to the captain. The captain has the final say on who flies, right? Go tell the captain that Roman Standish is demanding the removal of a hostile passenger." Up in the flight deck, Captain William Davies was completing his pre-flight checklist. He was a veteran pilot, a former Air Force commander who was nearing retirement. He was looking forward to a smooth flight to London and a pint of bitter at his favorite pub near Heathrow. Suddenly, the cockpit intercom chimed. Captain Davies picked up the handset. "Flight deck, go ahead." "Captain, it's Brenda," the purser's voice came through, sounding strained. "We have a severe passenger disturbance in first class. Seat 2B, a Mr. Roman Standish. He is aggressively harassing the passenger in 2A, using discriminatory language, and refusing to take his seat. He is demanding she be removed, and now he is demanding to speak to you." Captain Davies sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Is the passenger in 2A causing an issue?" "None at all, Captain. She's been perfectly calm. He's just, well, he's throwing a massive tantrum because he doesn't want to sit next to a black woman. To put it bluntly, he's threatening our jobs and refusing to let us close the boarding doors." The captain's eyes hardened. He despised bullies. "Stand by, Brenda. Tell him I'm reviewing the passenger manifest and I'll make a decision in exactly 2 minutes. Keep him contained." Davies turned to his first officer, pulling up the digital flight manifest on his screen. He scrolled down to row 2. Seat 2B, Standish, Roman. Seat 2A, Bennett, Celeste Doctor, VIP notification, emergency medical travel. Captain Davies clicked on the VIP notification attached to Celeste's name. As he read the attached notes from the airline's executive dispatch team, his eyebrows shot up. A slow, grim smile spread across the captain's face. "Oh, Mr. Standish," Captain Davies muttered to himself, unbuckling his harness. "You have picked the absolute wrong day, and the absolute wrong woman." The heavy, reinforced cockpit door unlatched with a sharp click that sounded like a gunshot in the tense, hushed atmosphere of the first-class cabin. Captain William Davies stepped out. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with silver hair neatly parted, his pristine white uniform adorned with the 4 gold stripes of a veteran commander. He carried a tablet in his left hand, and his expression was carved from granite. He walked past the galley and stepped into the aisle, his eyes immediately locking onto the commotion at row 2. Standish, seeing the captain approach, visibly relaxed his posture. A smug, triumphant smirk spread across his flushed face. In his world, executives dealt with executives. He fully expected this fellow man of authority to immediately recognize his status, shake his hand, and swiftly handle the problem sitting in seat 2A. "Ah, Captain," Standish said loudly, stepping out of the row to block the aisle, adjusting his bespoke suit jacket as if preparing for a boardroom negotiation. "Thank goodness. I'm Standish, Senior Executive Vice President at Vanguard Holdings. I'm afraid your purser and this young flight attendant are completely incapable of managing this cabin. I've been harassed and inconvenienced since the moment I boarded. I need this woman removed from my row immediately so we can push back from the gate." Captain Davies stopped 2 feet away from Standish. He didn't offer his hand. He didn't even acknowledge the executive's introduction. Instead, his gaze bypassed Standish entirely and settled on the woman sitting quietly by the window. "Dr. Bennett, Captain Davies said, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that commanded instant respect. His tone was surprisingly gentle. I am Captain Davies. I want to personally apologize for this disturbance. Are you all right, ma'am? Celeste, who had been maintaining a stoic, defensive posture, softened slightly at the captain's respectful demeanor. She offered a polite nod. I am perfectly fine, Captain. Just eager to get in the air. I have a very pressing schedule upon arrival in London. Standish's jaw dropped. He looked between the captain and Celeste as if they had both suddenly started speaking a foreign language. The smirk vanished, replaced by a dark, brewing storm of indignation. Excuse me? Standish snapped, stepping aggressively into the captain's line of sight. Did you not hear a word I just said? And why are you calling her doctor? I don't care if she has a PhD in art history. She is sitting in my row, she has been belligerent, and I want her off this aircraft. Captain Davies slowly turned his attention back to Standish. The look in the veteran pilot's eyes was chillingly cold. It was the look of a man who had flown fighter jets through combat zones and had zero tolerance for arrogant bullies in civilian airspace. Mr. Standish, is it? Captain Davies asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Yes. Roman Standish. Vanguard Holdings, he repeated, puffing his chest out again, desperate to wield his corporate title like a weapon. I fly hundreds of thousands of miles with Atlantic Airways. I demand. You are in no position to demand anything on my aircraft, Mr. Standish, Captain Davies interrupted, his voice slicing through the executive's tirade like a scalpel. He held up his tablet, tapping the screen once. I have just reviewed the passenger manifest and the flight logs. Doctor, Bennett's ticket is fully paid, verified, and correctly assigned to seat 2A. That is a glitch. Or a lie, Standish hissed, spittle flying from his lips. Look at her. She clearly doesn't belong here. The blatant, ugly prejudice hanging in the air caused a collective gasp from the surrounding passengers. Arthur Pendleton, the elderly British gentleman in 2D, slammed his newspaper down. Good God, man, do you hear yourself? You are an absolute disgrace. Shut up, Standish yelled back, completely losing his composure. He pointed a trembling finger at the captain. If you don't drag her off this plane right now, I will make one phone call, and I will have your wings stripped by tomorrow. Do you understand who you are dealing with? I know exactly who I am dealing with, Captain Davies replied evenly. I am dealing with a passenger who is violating federal aviation regulations by threatening my flight crew, screaming at his fellow passengers, and creating a hostile environment. Standish scoffed. A desperate, breathless sound. You wouldn't dare. Captain Davies took a deliberate step forward, forcing Standish to step back. You mentioned you are a senior executive vice president at Vanguard Holdings, correct? Standish blinked, thrown off by the sudden shift in topic. Yes, I report directly to the board, which is why you need to. And the chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings is Charles Montgomery, the captain continued, his eyes never leaving Standish's face. Is that accurate? Yes, Standish said, his voice faltering slightly, a tiny seed of doubt finally planting itself in his mind. Charles and I are close colleagues. We play golf at the same club. If I tell him how I've been treated on this airline, then you should know, Captain Davies interrupted, his voice echoing in the dead-silent cabin, that Mr. Montgomery's 6-year-old granddaughter, Lily, was involved in a catastrophic equestrian accident in London late last night. The color rapidly began to drain from Standish's face. The bluster and rage were suddenly replaced by sheer confusion. What does Charles's granddaughter have to do with this? She suffered a massive, highly complex trauma to her cervical spine, Captain Davies explained, his voice ringing with absolute clarity so that every single person in the first-class cabin could hear the impending devastation. Her condition is critical. The surgical intervention required is so delicate and so specialized that there are only a handful of surgeons on the planet qualified to perform it. Captain Davies slowly lowered his tablet. He gestured toward seat 2A. Mr. Montgomery's private office contacted Atlantic Airways Executive Dispatch 3 hours ago, pleading for an emergency override to secure a first-class seat on this specific flight. They personally paid $9,000 for this ticket. The captain locked eyes with Standish, delivering the final, crushing blow. Because Dr. Celeste Bennett is the chief of pediatric neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins. She is the specialist. Charles Montgomery begged to fly across the Atlantic to save his granddaughter's life. And you, Mr. Standish, are currently trying to throw her off the plane. For 10 agonizing seconds, the only sound in the first-class cabin of Flight 72 was the low, steady hum of the Boeing 777's auxiliary power unit. The silence was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed down on Roman Standish, burying him alive. The blood that had been boiling in his face just moments ago vanished completely, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen gray. His mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish pulled from the water. His eyes darted from Captain Davies to the imposing figure of Purser Brenda, and finally, agonizingly, to the quiet black woman sitting in seat 2A. Dr. Celeste Bennett sat there, her hands neatly folded in her lap, watching him. There was no malice in her eyes, no triumphant smirking. There was only the calm, clinical observation of a professional watching a man entirely orchestrate his own destruction. Standish stammered, his voice suddenly small, weak, and utterly devoid of its previous authority. I didn't know. Ignorance is not an excuse for bigotry, sir. Arthur Pendleton chimed in from across the aisle, delivering the British aristocratic equivalent of a finishing move. Nor does it excuse appalling manners. Captain. Standish took a shaky step backward, his hands coming up in a desperate, placating gesture. He suddenly realized the magnitude of his error. He hadn't just insulted a fellow passenger. He had directly endangered the family of the most powerful man in his corporate universe. If Charles Montgomery found out that one of his own executives had delayed the surgeon flying to save his granddaughter, his career wouldn't just be over. He would be blacklisted from Wall Street entirely. Captain, please, Standish begged, the sweat now visibly beading on his forehead. There's been a massive misunderstanding. I was stressed. The traffic to the airport was terrible. I apologize. I sincerely apologize to Dr. Bennett. I'll just sit down in 2B now. We can push back. Not another word from me, I swear it. He turned to the aisle seat and practically lunged for it, desperate to sit down and make himself invisible. Stop right there, Captain Davies commanded. Standish froze, hovering inches above the leather cushion of 2B. You are not sitting down, Mr. Standish, the captain said, his voice echoing with finality, because you are no longer a passenger on this flight. Standish stood up straight, panic fully gripping his chest. You can't do that. I apologized. I have a critical meeting in London tomorrow. You can't throw me off. I am the captain of this aircraft, and under international aviation law, I have the supreme authority to deny transport to any individual who poses a risk to the safety, security, or good order of this flight. Davies stated, quoting the manual with lethal precision, You aggressively harassed my crew. You used discriminatory, threatening language toward a fellow passenger, and you attempted to delay a critical medical transport. You are a security risk. Please. Standish's voice cracked, sounding entirely pathetic. My job. Charles will fire me. If I'm not in London. That sounds like a personal problem, Mr. Standish, Purser Brenda said, her voice laced with righteous satisfaction. She looked past him, toward the front galley. Officers, he's all yours. Standish whipped his head around. Standing at the entrance to the jet bridge were 3 armed airport police officers, accompanied by the stern-faced gate supervisor. They had been waiting silently in the galley for the captain's signal. Sir, gather your belongings, the lead officer said, stepping into the cabin, his hand resting casually but firmly on his duty belt. You need to come with us right now. No, wait, Standish pleaded, looking frantically at Celeste. Dr. Bennett, please, tell them it's fine. Tell them you accept my apology. I'll donate to your hospital. I'll double whatever Charles is paying you. Just tell them to let me fly. Celeste looked at the sweating, desperate man. She thought about the exhausting shifts, the systemic hurdles she had overcome her entire life, and the countless times men exactly like him had tried to make her feel small. She slowly picked up her noise-canceling headphones. My patients require my absolute focus, Mr. Standish, Celeste said, her voice smooth and unbothered. And right now, you are simply a distraction. She slipped the headphones over her ears, effectively erasing him from her world. The officers moved in. One of them grabbed Standish by the bicep, pulling him away from the row. Let's go, sir. Walk, or we'll make you walk. Humiliated, defeated, and realizing his corporate life was flashing before his eyes, Standish clumsily grabbed his briefcase from the overhead bin. As the police escorted him down the aisle toward the exit, a sound began to echo through the first-class cabin. Arthur Pendleton was clapping. It started as a slow, rhythmic golf clap, but soon, the other passengers in the premium cabin joined in. A chorus of applause followed Roman Standish as he was marched off the aircraft in absolute disgrace. Once the jet bridge door was finally closed and secured, Captain Davies walked to the front galley and picked up the PA microphone. A sharp ding echoed through the entire plane. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking," Davies announced, his voice echoing through every section of the Boeing 777. "I want to apologize for the delay in our departure. We had to return to the gate to remove a passenger who believed that his wealth entitled him to treat others with disrespect and bigotry. On Atlantic Airways, we do not tolerate discrimination of any kind against any passenger." The captain paused, and even the passengers in the very back row of economy could feel the gravity in his voice. "We are now cleared for pushback. I want to extend a special welcome to a VIP on board with us today, Dr. Celeste Bennett, who is traveling on an emergency medical mission. We are honored to have you flying with us, Doctor. Cabin crew, prepare for cross-check and departure. Next stop, London." Flight 72 finally touched down at London Heathrow, its heavy landing gear kissing the tarmac 45 minutes behind schedule. The morning sky over the city was a bruised, heavy gray, weeping a fine drizzle against the reinforced windows of the Boeing 777. But for Dr. Celeste Bennett, the delay and the weather dissolved into insignificance the absolute second the heavy aircraft doors swung open. She didn't have to join the weary herd of passengers navigating the labyrinth of customs and immigration. The moment she stepped off the jet bridge, her carry-on gripped firmly in one hand, a pair of sharply dressed private security contractors and a stern-faced Metropolitan Police liaison were already waiting, flanking the doorway like sentinels. "Dr. Bennett? Right this way, please. We have a helicopter waiting on the tarmac," the police liaison said, his voice clipped and urgent. He wasted no time, ushering her down a restricted, private stairwell that bypassed the terminal entirely. The transition from the tense, exhausting flight to the high-stakes reality of her profession was instantaneous. Within 20 minutes, the rhythmic, deafening chop of helicopter blades filled the cabin as Celeste was flown directly over the sprawling, rain-slicked skyline of London. She looked down at the winding ribbon of the River Thames, mentally reviewing the complex anatomical structures she was about to navigate. She was no longer just a passenger. She was a lifeline. The helicopter banked sharply, touching down on the elevated helipad of Great Ormond Street Hospital. The sterile, hyper-focused environment of the surgical ward swallowed her whole the moment she stepped through the double doors. Waiting for her in the private scrub room adjacent to Operating Theatre 4 was Charles Montgomery. The CEO of Vanguard Holdings was a man who routinely dictated terms to foreign governments, controlled a massive percentage of the global economy, and commanded thousands of employees with a single email. Usually imposing, impeccably tailored, and ruthlessly sharp, today he looked like a broken, hollowed-out shell of a man. His bespoke suit jacket was crumpled on a chair, his silk tie was missing, and the top buttons of his shirt were haphazardly torn open. His eyes were violently red-rimmed, sunken deep into a face aged a decade by a single night of unspeakable, paralyzing terror. When Celeste walked in, Charles practically collapsed into the nearest chair, the remaining strength leaving his legs. "Dr. Bennett, thank God. Thank God you're here," Charles gasped, his voice a ragged, desperate whisper. He looked up at her, tears freely tracking down his weathered cheeks. The swelling, the local trauma team said, if we waited another few hours, the cord would be permanently severed. They didn't want to touch her. "Mr. Montgomery," Celeste said. Her voice projected the calm, unshakable, and absolute confidence that had made her a living legend in the halls of Johns Hopkins. She didn't offer empty platitudes. She offered clinical certainty. She stepped closer, forcing him to meet her steady gaze. "I have reviewed Lily's latest scans on the flight. It is a complex C1-C2 fracture with severe spinal cord compression. It is critical, and it is incredibly delicate. But it is exactly what I specialize in. I need you to breathe," she commanded gently, her tone leaving no room for despair. I am going to go in there right now, and I am going to do everything in my mortal power to give your granddaughter her life back." Charles reached out, his hands trembling violently, and gently grasped her forearm. "Whatever you need, whatever the hospital needs, just please, save my little girl." Celeste offered a brief, resolute nod. She turned away, stepped up to the scrub sink, and began the meticulous, rhythmic process of washing her hands. The billionaire behind her faded away. The arrogant executive on the airplane ceased to exist. For the next 14 agonizing hours, Celeste Bennett did not eat, drink, or sit down. She stood beneath the blinding, heatless glare of the surgical lights, operating through a microscope on the most fragile, unforgiving nerve pathways in the human body. Her hands, steady as carved stone, repaired the catastrophic damage millimeter by microscopic millimeter. It was a grueling, excruciating ballet of medical mastery. While Celeste was performing quiet miracles in a sterile room in London, Roman Standish was living a suffocating, waking nightmare in New York. After being humiliatingly paraded off the aircraft by armed police, he was not allowed to simply leave. He was detained in a bleak, windowless security interrogation room in the bowels of JFK Airport for 3 agonizing hours. The walls were cinder block, the lighting was a flickering, fluorescent buzz, and the reality of his situation was finally crashing down on him. Because he hadn't physically assaulted anyone, the Port Authority police eventually released him without formal criminal charges, but the damage inflicted on his life was immediate and irreversible. The lead officer coldly handed him a thick stack of paperwork, including a formal trespass notice. Roman Standish, a Platinum Medallion member, was officially and permanently banned from flying Atlantic Airways. Absolute, raw panic set in. He had a career-defining, multi-billion-dollar merger meeting in London the very next afternoon. If he wasn't sitting at that table, Charles Montgomery would demand his head on a platter. Standing on the curb outside the terminal, shivering in his ruined suit, Standish frantically dialed his executive assistant, screaming into his cell phone for her to book him on another flight, on any carrier, immediately. "Roman, I'm trying," his assistant cried over the phone, the sound of frantic typing echoing in the background. "But Atlantic Airways canceled your return ticket too, and they've flagged your passport number in the shared international carrier database for a level 2 passenger disturbance. The major airlines are rejecting the booking. Find something. Anything." Standish roared, pacing the concrete like a caged animal. "I don't care what it costs. The only thing I could get you," she replied, her voice shrinking, "is a middle seat in the very back of a budget carrier leaving Newark Airport at 3 a.m. It was the absolute last seat available. Standish, a man who had not flown outside of a premium luxury cabin in 15 years, a man who had just demanded a woman be removed from his presence simply for breathing the same conditioned air, spent the next 7 hours trapped in his own personal hell. He was crammed into row 44E. The seat barely reclined, his knees were crushed against the plastic tray table. To his left was a screaming, colicky toddler who spilled apple juice on his trousers within the first hour. To his right was a man who aggressively chewed a pungent, onion-heavy tuna sandwich while watching action movies without headphones. Standish landed at Gatwick Airport, completely shattered. His bespoke suit was stained, wrinkled, and smelling faintly of sour juice and cheap fish. His nerves were entirely frayed to the point of snapping, and his towering ego was bruised beyond recognition. He sprinted through the terminal, hailed a cab, and hit brutal morning traffic. He finally arrived at the Vanguard Holdings London office, 5 hours late for the most important meeting of his professional life. He rode the elevator up to the executive floor, desperately praying he could somehow spin his disastrous absence, blame an airline glitch, and salvage the deal. He smoothed his ruined tie, completely and blissfully unaware that his ultimate fate had already been permanently sealed, the exact moment he opened his mouth to insult the quiet woman sitting in seat 2A. At exactly 8 a.m. the following morning, the pale, gray light of the London dawn began to filter through the blinds of the private family waiting room at Great Ormond Street Hospital. Charles Montgomery, a man who routinely dictated terms to foreign governments and commanded a global empire, sat slumped on a sterile vinyl couch. He looked like a man who had aged a decade in a single night. His custom-tailored shirt was severely wrinkled, his tie was discarded somewhere on the floor, and he stared blankly at the wall, The heavy door to the waiting room clicked open. Dr. Celeste Bennett walked in. She looked utterly exhausted. Her shoulders carried the invisible, crushing weight of 14 consecutive hours of high-stakes, microscopic surgical precision. She slowly pulled off her blue surgical cap, revealing hair flattened by sweat, and rubbed the deep, red indentations left by her magnifying loops on the bridge of her nose. Her hands, the million-dollar instruments that had just navigated the most treacherous pathways of the human nervous system, were trembling ever so slightly from the adrenaline crash. Yet, despite the bone-deep fatigue, a soft, triumphant smile rested on her lips. Charles stood up so fast he knocked his chair backward, the wood clattering loudly against the linoleum floor. He couldn't speak. His throat was completely locked tight with terror. He just looked at her, his eyes begging. Celeste didn't make him wait a single second longer. The compression is relieved, and the spine is fully stabilized, Celeste said softly, her voice raspy but steady. Lily is in recovery. All of her motor functions are responding beautifully to our preliminary tests. She is going to have a long, difficult road of physical therapy ahead of her. But Mr. Montgomery, she is going to walk again. For a moment, Charles just stood there, the words washing over him, his brain struggling to process the monumental weight of the miracle. Then, his knees gave out. The most powerful man on Wall Street collapsed to the floor. He openly, violently sobbed into his hands, his broad shoulders shaking as a tidal wave of agonizing relief tore through him. All the corporate armor, all the billions of dollars, meant absolutely nothing compared to the tiny, fragile life sleeping in the recovery ward. When he finally managed to compose himself, Charles slowly stood up, wiping his face with a trembling hand. He looked at Celeste with a reverence usually reserved for deities. "I owe you everything," Charles whispered fiercely, his voice cracking with emotion. "I will fund your entire pediatric department at Johns Hopkins for the next decade. Tell me what you want, Dr. Bennett. Anything. Name your price, name your research grant, and it is yours." Celeste smiled warmly, the exhaustion in her eyes softening. "I just want to see her wake up, Charles. That's all the payment I need." She paused, taking a slow breath, and her smile faded just a fraction as the adrenaline finally left her system, leaving behind the bitter memory of the flight. Though, I must admit, getting here was a bit more challenging than I anticipated. Charles frowned, hastily wiping the last tears from his eyes. His billionaire instincts immediately flared to life. Challenging? My private office paid top dollar for that first-class emergency routing. I had my team bypass every standard protocol. Did Atlantic Airways not treat you with the absolute utmost priority? The airline crew was spectacular, Celeste corrected smoothly, leaning against the doorframe. The captain was exceptional, and the flight attendants handled a very difficult situation with total professionalism. Unfortunately, one of your executives took extreme issue with my presence in the seat next to him. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Charles went entirely still. "One of my executives?" "Yes," Celeste replied calmly, stating the facts with the clinical detachment of a doctor diagnosing a disease. "He caused quite a severe disturbance in the cabin. He demanded I be sent to the back of the plane, aggressively insulted my ability to afford the ticket, and attempted to use his high-level status at Vanguard Holdings to have me removed entirely because he didn't want to sit next to a black woman. The captain had to have him forcibly removed by armed police before we could take off. I believe he delayed the flight by nearly an hour. An hour that, frankly, we barely had to spare for Lily." The lingering color completely drained from Charles Montgomery's face, instantly replaced by a deep, terrifying, mottled crimson. The mental image of his precious granddaughter slipping away by the minute on a hospital bed while one of his own highly paid employees threw a racist, elitist temper tantrum over a seat assignment ignited a fury inside the billionaire that defied human description. It was a cold, calculated, and absolute wrath. "What was his name?" Charles asked, his voice dropping to a deadly, quiet register. "A Mr. Roman Standish," Celeste replied. "Standish," Charles whispered, the name tasting like absolute poison on his tongue. He nodded once, his eyes dark and hollow. "Thank you, Dr. Bennett. Go be with Lily." 4 hours later, the scene at the Vanguard Holdings London branch was vastly different. Roman Standish pushed through the revolving glass doors of the towering skyscraper, smelling faintly of stale airplane coffee, cheap synthetic seat fabric, and sheer, unfiltered desperation. His bespoke charcoal suit, once a symbol of his authority, was a rumpled, stained disaster after spending 7 hours wedged into a middle seat in the very back of a budget carrier. He hadn't slept a wink. His nerves were entirely frayed, and his ego was bruised beyond recognition. He had arrived 5 hours late for the critical, career-defining merger meeting. He briskly walked past the reception desk, ignoring the startled look of the secretary, and marched straight toward the executive boardroom, aggressively rehearsing his excuses under his breath. He just needed to spin this. He needed to play the victim of an airline's incompetence. He pushed open the heavy mahogany doors, slapping on a wide, artificial smile. "Gentlemen, my deepest..." He stopped dead in his tracks. The massive, polished boardroom table was entirely empty. There were no lawyers, no rival executives, no presentation boards. There was only one man sitting at the absolute head of the table, silhouetted against the sweeping panoramic windows overlooking the London skyline. Charles Montgomery. Standish swallowed hard, a sudden, cold knot of dread forming in his stomach. But he forced the hearty, confident laugh of a salesman back into his chest and strode forward. "Charles!" Standish practically shouted, the false bravado echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "My profound apologies for missing the preliminary meeting yesterday and being late this morning. You wouldn't believe the absolute logistical nightmare I endured with the airline. A rogue employee on a massive power trip kicked me off my flight over a ridiculous clerical error. It was an outrage, but I am here now, and I've reviewed the prospectus, and I think we can easily..." "Sit down, Roman," Charles said. The words were not yelled. They were spoken with a voice so completely devoid of emotion, so chillingly flat, that they hit Standish like a physical blow to the chest. It was the voice of an executioner reading a sentence. Standish hesitated, his plastic smile faltering into a grimace of genuine confusion. He slowly sank into one of the plush leather chairs halfway down the table. "Charles, is everything all right? You look exhausted. How is Lily?" "Lily is recovering," Charles said coldly. He reached out and slowly slid a thick, heavy manila folder across the expanse of the polished wood until it came to a stop directly in front of Standish. "Thanks entirely to a brilliant pediatric neurosurgeon named Dr. Celeste Bennett." "Does that name ring a bell, Roman?" Standish's heart violently stopped. The blood rushed roaring into his ears, creating a deafening static. Bennett. The name echoed in his skull. The woman in seat 2A. The digital boarding pass. The VIP emergency notification the captain had mentioned. The devastating speech over the intercom. The pieces of the puzzle violently crashed together in his mind, finally forming a complete, horrifying picture of his absolute doom. He had harassed the one person on Earth who held his boss's heart in her hands. "Charles, Let me explain," Standish stammered, the color vanishing from his face. His hands began to shake so violently he had to grip the heavy leather armrests of his chair just to keep them steady. "I had absolutely no idea who she was. She didn't look like a VIP. I mean, there was a terrible misunderstanding with the boarding passes. And I have the official incident report from the captain of Flight 72 right there in that folder," Charles interrupted, his eyes burning with a terrifying, contained hatred. "I also have a copy of the Port Authority police report from JFK. You didn't just insult a passenger, Roman. You verbally abused a black woman out of sheer, unadulterated prejudice. You used my company's name, my name, to threaten an innocent flight crew. And worst of all, you actively attempted to delay the medical professional flying across an ocean to save my granddaughter's life because you thought your comfort was more important." "I was stressed," Standish practically shrieked, tears of genuine, pathetic panic welling in his eyes. He leaned forward, begging. "It was a mistake, a terrible, split-second lapse in judgment. I have given 20 years of my life to this firm, Charles. I've made you millions. You can't do this over one bad day. You're right. I can't let 20 years of service end with just a simple termination," Charles said, leaning forward into the light, his face an immovable mask of vengeance. "As of this exact second, you are fired for gross misconduct and a severe violation of our corporate morals clause." That means your executive severance package is completely void. Your golden parachute is gone. Your unvested stock options are instantly canceled. Charles, please. Standish sobbed, the reality of his financial ruin crushing him. I'll be ruined. I'll have nothing. Oh, we aren't finished, Charles continued softly, standing up from his chair. I am personally spending the rest of my afternoon calling every CEO, every board member, and every elite headhunter on Wall Street and in the City of London. I am going to send them these police reports. I am going to make absolutely sure that by the time you walk out of this building, you will not be able to get a job managing a fast food portfolio, let alone a wealth fund. You are a toxic asset, Roman, and you are done. Standish broke down completely. He wept openly, loudly, burying his face into his hands, begging for a mercy that would never, ever come. 10 minutes later, he was physically escorted out of the shimmering glass building by 2 burly security guards, carrying his prestigious 20-year career in a single, small cardboard box. The karma he had so recklessly earned in that first-class cabin had finally arrived, and it had annihilated him. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away from corporate boardrooms and ruined men, Dr. Celeste Bennett stood quietly by Lily's bedside in the intensive care unit. She watched with a gentle, tired smile as the little girl slowly fluttered her eyes open and weakly squeezed her grandfather's hand. Celeste didn't know what had happened to the angry, entitled man on the plane, and frankly, she didn't care. He was a ghost of the past. She simply adjusted her stethoscope around her neck, checked Lily's vitals one last time, and walked out of the room, preparing to go save her next patient. What a satisfying and explosive end to an incredibly tense situation. It just goes to show that arrogance, entitlement, and prejudice will eventually catch up to you in the most spectacular ways imaginable. Roman Standish thought his money and title made him the most important person in the room, but he learned the hard way that true value comes from what you can do for others, not what you demand from them. Dr. Bennett's incredible grace under pressure is something we can all admire. If this story of brutal, real-life karma gave you chills, make sure to hit that like button. Share this video with someone who loves seeing bullies get exactly what they deserve. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss out on our daily dramatic stories. Leave a comment below. What would you have done if you were in the captain's shoes?